Hello, welcome to the Retro Game Club podcast, Season 7, Episode 10, which is also Episode 199, almost to 200. I'm Rob, and joining me is someone who you've heard me mispronounce his name a few times, SM Oliva. Hello, welcome.
Good to be here, Rob.
Thank you. Sorry I was late. Again, I think I was late for my previous interview as well. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. It's a lovely evening here in Central Virginia, several time zones away. I think, how many time zones ahead of you? About 14?
Something like that. It's plus 11 here and minus 4 there. So there's some math there. There's some math.
Actually, later on when we get to Game Club, I will have a time zone related anecdote for you relevant to Game Club.
Nice. Well, you and I share a common and I think rare passion, very niche, of the Computer Chronicles.
It's not as niche as you might think. I think a lot of people into retro computing in particular are fans of the show. At least that's what I've discovered over the years. But yeah, for the past 4 years, I've written and published a blog called Computer Chronicles Revisited, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. I basically do a review of individual episodes of the show. So far I've reviewed 124 episodes.
Out of, do you know how many are there?
That's a good question. I have a master list somewhere. It's about 420.
Wow. I had no idea it was that many, but I guess that makes sense because they started, what was that, 83, 84?
So we'll get into the history. I can get into the history a little bit, yeah. But the program, as we know it, began in October 1983 and ran all the way up until June of 2002.
Okay. Wow, that's longer.
So it was 20 seasons. Not every season was the same length, but I can go a little bit into the history of the show.
Please do. Yeah.
So, as you know, if anybody who ever watched Computer Chronicles, the host for all 20 seasons was Stuart Chaffee. And he wasn't just the host, he was also the executive producer, and he was the person responsible for putting the show on the air in the first place. And that's kind of where the background story begins, because in 1978, Stuart took a job as the general manager at KCSM, which at the time, KCSM doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be a public television and radio station owned and operated by the College of San Mateo, which is a community college just south of San Francisco. And prior to this, Stuart had a career as a lawyer and a journalist. He'd actually been living in the Pacific for most of the 1970s. He'd worked as a station manager in American Samoa, and then he moved over to Hawaii for a few years.
Oh, wow.
He was a news director at, I believe, the NBC affiliate in Honolulu in the mid-'70s. But he decided at one point he didn't like working in for-profit news, so he took this job running a PBS station in San Mateo. And around 1980, he decided that, because one of your jobs when you're running a PBS station is to come up with local programming.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, San Mateo is right in the middle of what we would call Silicon Valley. So he's like, maybe we should do something about computers. And they came up with the first iteration of the show in 1981. This was a local live show. It was a live show. I think they did it Thursday nights at 7:30. And originally it was just supposed to be broadcast in San Mateo. Stuart didn't host this version. This version was very much, I've only ever seen one clip of this because they didn't keep any tapes of it. But this was much more like public access television at this point in PBS. It was hosted by a man named Jim Warren. And Jim Warren was kind of the first person to gain any kind of notoriety for being a tech journalist in the 70s. He was an editor of a number of early computer magazines and publications. And most famously, Jim Warren organized the West Coast Computer Fair, which was the first big microcomputer show. This would have been, I think, in 76 or 77. And that was the trade show where the Apple II and the Commodore PET debuted.
Okay.
So Jim Warren was basically the guy who knew everybody in the industry, because the industry at the time only consisted of about 100 people.
Yeah.
So he hosted this local program from 81 to 82 in San Mateo. And as they were airing the local shows, Stewart started getting calls from the other PBS managers, because even though there was no internet in 81, there were bulletin board systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the computer nerds watching the show in San Mateo were talking about this show on the PBSs. And so all the other nerds were calling their PBS stations and saying, why aren't you airing this? And so that's when Stewart started to realize he might have something on his hands here. And they took a year off in 82, 83 to sort of retool the concept. Warren didn't stick around because he was a busy guy doing other things. And Stewart eventually realized, or maybe was persuaded, that because of his background as an on-air journalist, that he would be the perfect person to actually step in and host the program. So they relaunched the show as a national program, as I said, in October of 83, and then it, ran for 20 years.
And was, oh my gosh, I just forgot English. The founder of Digital, Gary Kildall, part of it?
Yeah, so the way Gary Kildall became involved was, as I said, even though this was a public broadcast, PBS in the United States doesn't have commercials, but the shows do have to have sponsors to underwrite the production costs.
And that's where we should get into who Gary Kildall is, because he is a luminary, right?
Right. So I'll get to Gary in a second.
Okay.
But so basically what happened was Stewart started making the rounds of different companies to be underwriters. Now, the company that eventually was the original underwriter was a company called Micro Focus. They underwrote the first season. I think the first season had a budget of $350,000 for 26 shows. So this was not a high. Well, if you've ever seen old Computer Chronicles, it was not a high budget production.
Yeah, a lot of cardboard cutouts in there. Yeah, not a lot of sets.
I remember someone said to me when I started doing the blog and I was on social media, someone's like, we need to recreate this show the way it was. And I said to the guy, we can't build a set that cheap anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We can't replicate that cardboard. But anyhow, so Stewart was making the rounds looking for underwriters. And at one point he had a deal with Apple, but Steve Jobs vetoed it at the last minute because Jobs was incensed that the show would feature non-Apple products.
Oh, wow.
But this leads us to Gary. So Gary Kildall at Digital Research was one of the other people Stewart called upon. And Gary not only didn't have a problem with, talking about other products, he offered to co-host the show because he thought it was a great idea.
I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, I heard he was kind of pushy about it. Like maybe Stewart didn't really want to co-host, but Gary was kind of insistent.
Every interview I've heard with Stewart, and I don't know the truth, but every interview that Stewart's ever given, he's said that he always wanted a co-host. So I've not heard that, but again, I obviously was not.
And Gary was a great co-host.
Yeah. So Gary Kildall, in brief, for people who don't know, Gary was an academic. He was got a PhD in computer science. He was teaching computer science at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, which was about 2 hours south of San Mateo. And in the early 1970s, Intel hired him as a contractor to write. At this point, it wasn't an operating system. It was just referred to as a control program for their first microprocessor. I think it was the 4004. And in those days, software had such little commercial value that Intel didn't even claim the rights to it. Like they told Gary, like, if you want to keep the rights to this and spin it off into something, go ahead. It's not going to be worth anything. And it was actually Jim Warren, I believe, who was one of the people who talked Gary into sort of building a company, right? Because Gary really wasn't interested in building he wasn't Bill Gates. He wasn't interested in building a giant company necessarily. He was just a guy. He was an academic who really loved software and loved software development. And eventually he spun his control program out into CP/M, which was, of course, the first big operating system for microcomputers. And he co-hosted the first 8 years of the show from 83 to 90, or 7 years, I think, 83 to 90. In 1990, he sold Digital Research and basically retired. And unfortunately, he passed away very young in 1994 after a freak accident. And so that's kind of why he's fallen out of a lot of computer histories these days, because he just has, he died before the internet even took off.
Well, and a lot of people have described him to me as just too nice for Silicon Valley. he was chewed up. Other people who wanted to be billionaires really took advantage of nice people like him.
Well, and as I said, his background was that of an academic. As a matter of fact, his paternal grandfather, he was originally from Seattle. His paternal grandfather actually ran a college for merchant marine soldiers, and Gary actually taught there as a teenager.
Oh, wow.
He taught navigation to sailors. So I mean, Gary was an academic at heart. He was not a guy. Bill Gates, of course, famously dropped out of Harvard to start Microsoft because that was really
Gary's not
his
cutthroat.
interest. And digital research in these days was run out of an old Victorian house in Monterey. Like, it was a very small scale operation for most of its history. But unlike, again, going back to what I said about like Jobs not wanting to sponsor non-Apple stuff, I mean, Gary was there when they talked about Microsoft stuff, and it wasn't like he was ever a jerk about it. I mean, he was always happy to talk about any product that anybody brought to him. Although, as we'll get into, there were a couple of times when Gary's buttons were pushed.
I do want to get into those.
I thought the best way we could approach this, since this is a game podcast, is to sort of talk about how the show covered gaming in the early years.
Yeah, and there was a few episodes that throughout the years.
So, in terms of what I've covered on the blog so far, I've covered most of the first 6 years, and there's been 4 different episodes focused specifically on computer gaming, although gaming comes up in other episodes as well. Obviously, when you get into the 90s, they do a lot more gaming coverage, because obviously that's when DOS and Windows gaming take off, and they actually start taking consoles seriously. Because in the 1980s, they almost never talk about console gaming.
Yep. Maybe a mention at their special CES episodes and stuff like that, but that's about it.
Well, so the very first computer gaming episode they did was from the first season, and that episode was recorded February of 1984. So, and I would say the most notable thing of that episode is, I suspect for a good portion of the people watching, it was the very first time they ever heard of a company called Electronic Arts. Because EA was, in these days, EA was the plucky startup. And Trip Hawkins appeared on the show. Trip Hawkins, the founder and CEO and founding CEO of Electronic Arts. And, the company, he formed the company at the end of 82, but they didn't really start launching product until the summer CES in 83, which was June of 83. And they had the first products on the shelves Christmas of 83. So this is early 84 when they're taping. And again, for a lot of the people in the country, EA is a completely new concept to them, which is it's just wild to think about that today, right? 40 years later. Just like EA is just this, startup that's like, ooh, will they make it?
Yeah.
And they demonstrate 2 games in this episode. Trip Hawkins appeared with Bill Budge, and Bill Budge was one of the original game designers who worked with EA. And they demonstrated Budge's game, which was called Pinball Construction Set. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'm not. No.
So Pinball Construction Set came about. So both Budge and Hawkins had worked at Apple. Hawkins was a marketing guy at Apple, and Budge was a programmer. And Budge had basically, he was not much of a gamer, Budge, but he was a through and through programmer. And he started to notice they had like a game room at the first Apple headquarters in Cupertino. And he noticed that that his coworkers in the game room were playing a lot of pinball. So he thought it might be a fun programming challenge to make a pinball game for the Apple II, which he did. And he self-published that game. It was called Raster Blaster. And it sold moderately well for an Apple II game circa 1980. But then he thought it would be more fun to create a game that would let you create your own pinball tables. And that became Pinball Construction Set. That's literally what it was. It was a very simple GUI, kind of modeled on the original Mac interface. And you would drag and drop pinball table parts onto a playfield, and you could actually just make and play your own little pinball tables on the Apple II.
Yeah, it's a great idea for a game, and really ambitious for Apple II.
Yeah, but again, Budge worked at Apple, and he knew the system as well as anybody did because he was Budge didn't do much. This was sort of the height of his game career. He went on to have a very long career as just a regular programmer. In fact, I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and he had just retired after working for a decade on the Google Chrome team.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he spent he had like a 45-year career just as a programmer, but this was kind of his one big foray into gaming. So anyhow, he initially self-published the construction set like he did Raster Blaster, but he really wasn't interested in running a game company. So when Hawkins came along and said, "Why don't we publish the game for you?" He did, and of course he gave him a good deal to publish it. So that became one of the first 6 titles that EA launched with. One of the other titles was the one was the one that Tripp himself demonstrated on Chronicles, which was Dr. J versus Larry Bird one-on-one basketball.
A classic. I had that one.
Well, which system? Because it was originally an Apple II game. So
yeah,
what
Apple II.
Yeah. I had an Apple IIc growing up, but I don't think I had that game. I don't remember, at least.
Yeah, my cousin had an Apple IIe, I think, and then in '86 we got the WAS Edition 2GS, and obviously went over to my cousin's house and copied a lot of games.
But yeah, so Tripp demonstrated that game himself on air, and again, I would say probably for 95% of the people watching the show, this is the first time they'd ever seen that game, or seen, because again, EA was a brand new company, and. So they had that, and then there was another segment they did focusing on Atari. Now, keep in mind, February of '84, we're kind of the crash has been going on for about a year now, and the original Atari is now circling the drain.
Yeah,
but they still got a couple of Atari games on there. One of which was a game called Excalibur by the shall I say legendary developer Chris Crawford.
I've never played that one. And I don't think I really know Chris Crawford.
So Chris Crawford is a very interesting character if you look into his background. He basically quit game development in the early 90s because he decided that computer games and video games in general were kind of beneath him. he was one of those people.
Yeah.
And I wish I could explain Excalibur to you, but even after watching the demo and even after running it in an emulator for my blog post, I still have no idea what this game is or what it's supposed to be.
Nice.
It is a completely inscrutable. I think it's an early attempt at making something like Crusader Kings, but I can't tell. Like literally, the game is inscrutable. It's completely it's indescribable. You can watch the show, I suppose, yourself and try and figure it out. And then the other Atari game they demonstrated was a game called Space Shuttle, which was quite literally a space shuttle flight sim for the Atari 2600. And this was impressive. Like, if you watch this demo, it is an impressive demo because the developer, now I should say the developer appeared on the program. She's long gone under the name Jessica Stevens. She went under a different name back then. That's all I'm going to say about that. But she literally had to use, like, you know how like the 2600 had all those switches on top?
Yeah.
You had to use all the switches to make the thing work because you couldn't just use a one-button joystick with this thing.
Yeah.
So she literally, like, this may have been the single most impressive feat of 2600 programming I've ever seen. Because, I mean, it's a really well-done space shuttle flight sim. But the problem is, like, I started reading some of the reviews when I was doing the blog post. It's a real-time flight sim. It takes like an hour to play it. Because you simulate a full space shuttle launch and docking with what I guess was Skylab back then. And so it's an impressive game, but, like, how many people were actually going to play this thing?
I'm looking this up right now. Because I remember the cart for this, but I don't remember anything else.
It was ported to other systems, I should say. Okay, it wasn't just on the 2600. And in fact, one of the great, well, not great, but one of the sort of saddest coincidences was when I was doing the research. I don't think I put this in the blog post, but when I did the research, in January of '86, it was an Activision. It was a game made under contract for Activision. Activision put out a press release in January of '86 touting the fact that they had finally hit sales of 50,000 across all platforms for the computer version of the game. The day they issued the press release was the day of the Challenger explosion.
Oh no, of course.
Just like, and Activision was already kind of in a bad place at that point, so that was kind of just rubbing salt on the wounds at that point.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of funny that like the two Atari games they show on Chronicles are like two games that I'm guarantee you no kid ever actually played.
Yeah.
I should point out the Crawford game was not for the 2600. The Crawford game was for the Atari 800. It was a computer game.
And, to kind of highlight what you're saying, the Computer Chronicles really were a platform for new companies, new ideas, a lot of things that maybe, we'll get into the other iteration of the show later, but other ideas that, maybe didn't work out, or maybe it didn't seem like the best idea at the time, but became one of the biggest companies in the world, and that's why it's fascinating going back now and watching these and being brought back to the before the internet kind of ruined everything, where everyone was kind of naive to where all this was going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even Activision at the time, Activision was already an established company in 83, 84, but they were still a very small company. Mm-hmm. Oh, in terms of relative to, say, the business software companies. I mean, Gary's company, Digital Research, was probably 10 times the size of Activision in terms of sales.
Yeah.
Because mostly it was still mostly a business software market in terms of the computers, not the console, obviously.
Yeah, it was all VisiCalc and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously business. One of the most fascinating episodes they did in the early run. This was an '85 show. They did an entire episode about software piracy, mm-hmm. and they had an actual teenage software pirate on the show. He appeared under a pseudonym, of course. He didn't use his real name. And sitting next to him was the general counsel of Activision.
Oh my God!
who was just salty as can be. He was so. And this guy, his name was Smith McKeithen, and he was a career intellectual property attorney. Like he wasn't like some friend of the Activision CEO who was just doing a fair. Like he was a real IP lawyer, and he was just like, why am I putting up with this nonsense? And what's interesting though is that Gary didn't defend piracy, but Gary did get into a bit of an argument with the Activision lawyer because, as I said, this was 1985. And so this is when you're starting to see hard drives on the higher end business computers, mm-hmm. like on the PCs, not on the home computers, obviously. Mm-hmm. But of course, once you have hard drives, people want to be able to copy their software to the hard drive and just run it off the hard drive. And McKeithen, the Activision lawyer, was basically saying, well, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody need to copy software to a hard drive? They should just run it off the floppy disks. And Gary was just kind of befuddled by that. But again, they were kind of talking past each other because, again, most of your business software, like you mentioned, VisiCalc, by this point, Lotus 123 was kind of the dominant spreadsheet. Lotus 123 cost like $500.
Yeah.
So if you were paying $500 for your spreadsheet, you didn't want the company telling you weren't allowed to copy it to your hard drive.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's one of the most interesting things I found. And this was when I was researching the Piracy Show. By 1987, every major business software publisher had dropped copy protection. They weren't even trying to do copy protection in the business software market. The game companies were still doing it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Big time.
Because they were still pissed off about piracy. But in the business software market, it was gone. Mm-hmm. It was gone. I think Lotus was the last one to drop it.
I think my favorite episodes start around like the 1987 mark. I really like the early 90s episodes, like just about when the Pentium was about to release, just because a lot of the weird Mac stuff was coming out then. You had a lot of the, goofy, useless applications like the screensaver, type stuff.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up because I think it was 87 when they start talking about HyperCard. And boy, for a while there, they loved HyperCard on the Mac. Well, in fact, one of the regular contributors, Chronicles had other regular contributors, of course, besides Stuart and Gary. One of the other regulars was Jan Lewis, who was an industry analyst. She actually got so pumped up about HyperCard, she started a HyperCard magazine. It only lasted 2 issues, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that's how big it was. People were making HyperCard specific magazines.
And then I can't believe I watched. So there's a Twitch channel called Old Timey Computer Show, I think it is, and I put it on all the time because it often is just running episodes of Computer Chronicles. It also does a whole bunch of other stuff, but probably twice a day it has a few episodes of Computer Chronicles. Anyway, my point is I watch Computer Chronicles a lot. At least it's in the background when I'm working and stuff like that. And I can't remember they end each episode with a news segment, which is called
Random Access.
Random Access. Oh my God, thank you.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite parts because it'll say like, Apple releasing a 16-bit computer, and they get a bunch of things wrong, or they like speculate on something that they have no idea how right they were, and it's just fascinating watching this stuff now.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I as I was doing the blog, I used to recap the news segments. I had to stop doing that though because unfortunately, a lot of the episodes we have are reruns. Mm-hmm. So like I was having like a January 87 episode, but the news segment was from February of 89.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, a lot of them are reruns. So that's why I don't recap the news segments anymore on the blog, just because it creates a weird time discontinuity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't realize that. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. Sometimes it's the original episode, sometimes it's not. But well, the other thing that's kind of interesting, if you ever go back and watch that first year, 83, 84, mm-hmm. So when Micro Focus sponsored the first year, part of the arrangement was they actually made 2 versions of the show. They made the version that aired on PBS, and they made a second version that was actually packaged and sold as a college course on computers. Mm-hmm. And it was actually a course, and they had these interstitial segments that was hosted by another person, like in between the Computer Chronicle segments, talking about different aspects of the computer industry. And some of the first season episodes you find are from the telecourse version of the program.
Interesting. Okay.
So like in the middle of the show, this other guy shows up and starts summarizing what you just watched, like you're in a classroom, and he needs to summarize the concepts for you. Well, and they only did that for the first year, though.
So, moving on, so we don't take too much of your time.
Sure.
I have a note here for Mr. Gameshow and Galoob.
Okay, so every year, Chronicles would do a holiday show. Basically, Stuart would get all the regulars around the big wooden table, and they would all recommend, tech gifts for the holidays. And in 86 and 87 in particular, a lot of people in the computer media were fascinated by the idea of robot toys or toys with computer chips in them that weren't video games, basically. Mm-hmm. And one of the regular contributors was Wendy Woods, who did most of their remote segments. Lovely woman, by the way. I actually gotten to talk to her a little bit. And Wendy in particular seemed to get stuck every year showing off the robot toys. And I believe it was the 87 Christmas episode where she shows off this thing called Mr. Gameshow, which was a toy made by Louis Galoob and Company. And I think I think our listeners, if you hear the name Galoob, you think either Game Genie or Micro Machines first.
Yeah.
But Mr. Gameshow kind of came before that. And so basically, you remember Teddy Ruxpin?
Yeah.
You know, it was a talking teddy bear that you put a cassette tape into and it told stories. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Gameshow was basically Galoob's response to that. It was basically, what if we took the idea of Teddy Ruxpin, but instead it was a game show host? And so the actual toy, and I had this. My parents got this for me for Christmas, so I actually played with this thing, this monstrosity against all that is holy. It's a 14-inch plastic figure made to resemble like a stereotypical game show host. The face looks like a ventriloquist dummy, basically. Mm-hmm. And it's standing on top of a computerized base with a membrane keyboard and a small play screen. And you put cassette tapes in the thing, and the tapes make the game show figure talk. And it basically plays simple Wheel of Fortune style word games. And Wendy demonstrated this thing. There was another robot toy. There was a talking doll she also demonstrated called Julie, which was a talking doll that had like sensors in it. So like if the temperature got too low, the doll would say I'm cold, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of these toys did well at all during the holiday season. Partly because they were both priced over $100.
Okay, yeah.
And what I said in my blog post was this was during this particular holiday season, you could walk into a store and buy an NES base system for $70.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think this was the second Christmas that the NES was on sale. This was like the big year for the NES, which they never mentioned on the show, of course. But they're talking about these $100 talking dolls like it's going to be the next big thing. And the Julie doll, Julie was made by a company called Worlds of Wonder. Literally 2 weeks after Wendy showed this doll, the Julie doll on Chronicles, 2 weeks later, Worlds of Wonder filed for bankruptcy.
Oh, nice.
They didn't even make it to Christmas.
Oh, that's so sad.
And by the way, they were the company that made Teddy Ruxpin originally.
Yeah.
So that was a Worlds of Wonder. The great irony is Worlds of Wonder was the company that helped Nintendo get into the North American market in the first place.
That's right. Yeah. And
because it was their marketing people who basically helped set up their retail operation in North America.
Yeah. And so,
as for Galoob, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, Mr. Game Show almost sank Galoob. Like Galoob took a huge loss on Mr. Game Show, and the only reason they didn't end up like Worlds of Wonder is they had also started making Micro Machines, and Micro Machines was a huge hit.
Oh yeah. Oh,
because those were cheap. Those were cheap toys that people would actually buy. And then, of course, Game Genie, I think, was 1990, if I remember. That was a couple of years later.
And then Computer Chronicles spun off into Net Cafe as well, which I adore. I adore this show.
Yeah, you've seen more Net Cafe. So Net Cafe was actually a companion show. The two shows actually ran parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Net Cafe ran from 96 to 2002. And yeah, obviously, once the internet became a thing, Stewart decided to spin off all the internet stuff into a show. And they did record the show in a real San Francisco internet cafe.
Sometimes really late at night too.
Yeah, I remember reading in one account. I think they started taping like 8 p.m. and would record up until like 1:30 in the morning. Because one thing I should mention too about production on Chronicles, which I think is fascinating, as I mentioned, Stewart. When the show began, Stewart was also the GM at the San Mateo PBS station. But after the first season, he left that job. In '84, he decided to go back to. He's originally from Pennsylvania, so in the summer of '84, he decided to go back to Pennsylvania and took over as the head of the PBS station in Harrisburg. So for the next 8 or 9 years, he was commuting to San Mateo to tape Chronicles every other weekend.
Oh wow!
So he would work a full day on Friday in Pennsylvania, get on the red eye, show up in San Mateo on Saturday, record 2 episodes up until about 5:30 p.m., and then the next day fly back to Pennsylvania.
Wow!
So he was real. I mean, he was really working in those days.
And I mean, and Net Cafe is so charming. There's 2 other hosts,
right?
And one of them became pretty big in Silicon Valley. I forget her name off the top of my head. But
yeah, as I said, I've only screened a couple of Net Cafes because I'm still stuck in 1989 right now in my timeline. I've got a few years to go.
If you're ever nostalgic for the glory days of the early internet and all the wonder it brings, and they really cover like a lot of this, like. They bring up a bunch of online sales sites, in one episode, and eBay is one of them, and it's new, and you didn't know which one was going to be the big one. And
I know there's a Chronicles episode from 97 or 98 that has a very young Jeff Bezos still with his hair.
Yep.
But as I said, I haven't gotten around to screening a lot of Net Cafe at this point, But yeah, obviously, as I said, again, at that point, now by that point, Stewart wasn't running the station in Harrisburg anymore. I think he moved back to California, and he was working full time on both shows in California by that point. So he was no longer doing a bi-coastal commute. I don't think he could have done both shows living in Pennsylvania.
I did email Stuart once to try to get him on this show, but by that time, this is probably 5 years ago now, he was already in his 80s, I think. I don't think he's...
I think he's 80. I think he's 85, and I know he underwent major back surgery last year, and he's been out of commission. As a matter of fact, I've actually been in regular contact with Paul Schindler, who used to do the software reviews on Chronicles. Yeah. And Paul was saying Paul asked me if I knew how to contact Stuart because he wanted to get in touch with him.
Oh, that's
like, funny. No, I don't know, but yeah. But so another Chronicles you alluded to earlier, some of the ideas before its time. I think we should probably talk briefly on the Halcyon situation.
Yeah.
So the Halcyon. So they did an episode in '85 on optical disk storage, which was one of Gary Kildall's pet. One of the lesser known things about Gary is that Gary actually had a second company that he created to do early CD-ROM software technology.
Mm-hmm.
It was originally called Activenture, but then Activision said that name was too close to our name, and so they renamed the company Knowledge Set. It didn't last long, but it was a company that developed a lot of early. Knowledge Set basically developed the early software that would let you actually search a CD-ROM, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did this big show on optical storage, which, again, was the type of topic that Gary just loved to talk about. Unfortunately, the guest they brought on did not please Gary, and it was a man named Rick Dyer. And Rick Dyer his biggest claim to fame is he was the guy who developed the technology for the game Dragon's Lair.
Okay, yeah.
Which I know you've heard of.
Oh yeah,
you probably played.
It was a Game Club game for sure.
Yeah, Dragon's Lair, of course, was the famous Laserdisc arcade game with the Don Bluth animation. Well, Dyer was the guy whose company developed the actual tech for that. And of course, the Laserdisc gaming thing never really took off after Dragon's Lair. Dragon's Lair was kind of a one-hit wonder. So Dyer thought it might be a good idea to develop a home console using Laserdisc.
Oh, yeah, I have seen this episode, yeah.
And, well, now, originally it wasn't Laserdisc. Originally it was using a technology called CED, which was RCA's attempt to get into the market. CED was not optical. You know what CEDs are?
No.
So a CED basically it looks like a vinyl record. It even has like a little stylus that reads it. It's a non-optical recording disc technology that RCA briefly. If you ever watch the YouTube channel Technology Connections, I think, did a big CED thing.
It comes in a big cartridge, right?
Right. So anyhow, Dyer had started making a game console based on CED, but then when the CED technology flamed out, he scrambled to redevelop it as a laser disc console.
Mm-hmm.
This was a prototype they brought to Chronicles, and there were two games developed for it. One was called Thayer's Quest, which I know was later re-released on other platforms. I don't know much about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a Dragon's Lair type of game. It wasn't done. I don't think it was done by Don Bluth. But so he brings this Thayer's Quest demo on, and he names the system Halcyon. And by the way, he says he used the name Halcyon was a reference to the HAL 9000. Why would you name your console after a killer computer?
Yeah.
That should have been the first red flag that things were not going to go well. So the other thing I should mention about this Halcyon was not only was it going to be a laser disc-based game console, it was also going to use voice recognition controls.
Oh, geez, that never goes well.
Well, and it didn't go well because they set up the game and they had Stuart do the demo. And as Gary would later talk about, Stuart had a very good booming, newscaster voice. And Stuart's sitting there and he's trying to do the voice control and it doesn't work. I mean, it just flat out does not work. And then Gary starts to get really annoyed because Dyer keeps claiming that, well, this product has artificial intelligence technology.
Oh.
And if there was one way to set off Gary Kildall in the 1980s, it was to claim your product had AI features.
Yeah.
Gary was not going to put up with your nonsense about AI. And he almost, at one point I thought Gary was going to leap over the table and throttle him, but he didn't. Gary was a gentleman. But yeah, the Halcyon demo was just, years later, before Gary died, he had started working on a memoir, and his family later released the unpublished manuscript. And Gary singled this out as basically the single worst moment of the time he spent on Computer Chronicles.
Wow.
was the Halcyon demo, just because he was more annoyed, I think, by the voice recognition thing and the claim that it was AI. That was really the part that stuck with him. He wasn't particularly mad at Dyer. Like, he actually said he felt bad for the guy because his product. But the other thing too is, even assuming this thing worked, it was going to retail for $5,000.
Yeah, that's not.
I mean, if you thought the 3DO was expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, that was kind of in terms of legendarily bad demos. That one stands out as one of the worst demos, just in terms of it just flat out not working.
So how do you recommend listeners watch Computer Chronicles? Mostly archive.org?
Yeah, so actually, yes. When Stuart actually worked with the Internet Archive for many years, and he donated all of the tapes for the show to the archive.
Oh wow!
And so like when you see it on the archive, I mean, that's official. That's him giving them the tapes. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of missing episodes. The archive has all the tapes, but they haven't digitized all of them yet. There are about 20, I think there's about 25 episodes that have never been archived. But yeah, you can just go to the Internet Archive, and they have a complete everything that's been digitized to this point, they have on the archive.
That's awesome. And also, so how can listeners find your blog, podcast, and you have some books, right?
Well, so yeah, smoliva.blog, smoliva.blog. That's where that's sort of the center for everything. That's where I have the blog. I do an occasional podcast where I just sort of go in depth on topics that are from the show, but not kind of directly related to the show. And I also publish occasional compilations of the blog post as ebooks, because some people just prefer to read the blog that way. Because, a typical blog post is about 5,000 words.
Yeah. So why not?
Between the recap and the research. So.
Well, nice. Any closing thoughts on Computer Chronicles?
No, just that it was, it's probably one of the most important resources we have to examine the history of early computing in the 80s and 90s. And it's, if nothing else, Stuart donating all of that to the archives itself was just a great act of historic preservation. And
it's entertaining to watch. Like, I know not everyone that listens to this podcast is an uber nerd, but by the way, have you ever seen the one with Roberta Williams demonstrating Phantasmagoria? Oh yeah. That's a personal favorite from the 90s run. Yeah, classic. But even if, you're not into the old, very vintage to some of you computers, like, it's still very entertaining to watch. Some of the early stuff before GUIs and stuff like that may not grab you, but hop around different seasons and you'll find some that are fun. But do you care to jump into some podcast news? Well, let's podcast. Yeah, let's podcast. Yeah. Well, so the first one I have here is that if you run Mario 64 continuously for 14 months, a lot of weird bugs happen. And the guy that kind of decompiled and rewrote Mario 64 into C, and he also writes his own ports of, I don't want to say ports, different versions of Mario 64. Kaze goes into this in depth, telling you like why this happens, stuff like that. Yeah, I did have a chance to look at some of the video. It is just, I don't have much of a response to it because, like, who's going to be running this game for 14 days straight? It's like 14 months straight, yeah. Yeah, 14 months. It reminds me. You ever watch? You ever see the YouTuber Marcel Voss? He does YouTube videos on Roller Coaster Tycoon. I've seen at least one. I remember he did a video one time where he created a ride that he created a roller coaster that would take the history of the universe to actually complete in real time because of how slow it moves. That was like what I thought of when I saw this story. It's like, it is sort of funny how much you can push a computer like that. Yeah, it's pretty funny. Like, weird stuff happens. Like the Rainbow Cruiser will just stop flapping. Like weird stuff like that. Stuff that there's no way they could test for it. And let's see. No. Next in the news is on Amazon. It was for pre-order, and now it looks like it's for regular order.
It has been released. I checked.
Yes,
Yeah.
a Pac-Man official cookbook. So if you want to cook some ghosts, well, food that looks like ghosts and stuff
I
like
was
that.
going to say, do they have the pretzel? Because they used to have the pretzel in Pac-Man on one of the levels.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yep. And they have something that looks like cherries, some weird pizza recipes that have, because I guess Pac-Man has to look like pizza.
You remember that Futurama episode where they do the thing about Pac-Man?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when they get out of the maze, Dr. Zoidberg coughs up all the stuff, and he coughs up the key because the key was on the later levels.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's what I thought of when I saw this story. But I didn't realize until I did a little bit of a deep dive. I was looking at the author's other credits, and she's done other like media-related cookbook tie-ins. I didn't realize video game cookbook tie-ins were really a thing.
Hey, anything. I remember a few years ago, actually right around when this podcast started, there was Pac-Man sake you could buy in Tokyo. One flavor for each Pac-Man and all the ghosts. And yeah, I think cookbooks are kind of money grabs, but this one's kind of funny. Might be fun just to kind of leave this out on your coffee table as a conversation starter. And
Yes.
And then the last news item, only 3 this week that I picked out, was OutRun comes to the Game Boy Color thanks to a very nice unofficial port. And this is very impressive.
I do love me some OutRun. It used to be one of my favorite arcade games as a kid.
Oh, yeah. And if you watch the video of this or if you download this port, it's done. They have all the music in there. They have all the special effects. It really doesn't... I mean, the screen's so small that it's not having to do much sprite scaling, but it is still very impressive. It's a real OutRun game. It looks good. It looks fun to play, actually, unlike, a lot of Game Boy ports. So definitely check this one out for sure.
Yeah, it's great.
And that is all the news. And we have some Game Club. So
we do.
Last episode, I chose Kicks, which until last episode, for my whole life, I pronounced Quicks.
Yeah, it is Kicks, and since I am somebody who loves doing historical research, I actually did quite a bit of a deep dive into researching the background of this game.
Oh, please get into it. You start. Go for it.
So this game is interesting because it was actually one of the very first games developed by Taito America. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the Taito in Japan. And in 1980, there was a new president hired at Taito America, and he basically decided to prioritize U.S.-based game development. And he brought in a guy named Randy Pfeiffer to lead development. And Randy Pfeiffer was based in California. He had been designing hardware boards for pinball games I think he was working for Bally Midway doing some of their pinballs. Mm-hmm. Or no, Williams. He was designing pinball tables, I think, for Williams. And what's interesting to me is he developed Kicks with his wife Sandy, and I was doing some digging into their backstory. They actually met. They were introduced to one another in early 1980 by a mutual friend. They were engaged 6 days later and got married 6 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
And as far as I know, they're still married. Mm-hmm. But and by the end of that year, the end of 1980 is when they signed the development contract with Taito America. And the game was out. The game came out, I think it hit the arcades November of 81.
Yeah.
So, this came together. This came together fairly quickly for them. And they ended up developing a couple of other games for Taito America. I don't think the other games did very well. And they ended up selling their rights in Kicks back to Taito America for, I think, $150,000. And they used that money to start up another company, which was called Genesis Electronics. And I alluded to Time Zone's situation earlier. So one of the things that was annoying Randy Pfeiffer when he was developing Kicks was him and his wife were based in California. Taito America was based in Illinois, and of course Taito was based in Japan.
Yeah, and
he was having a hell of a time coordinating phone calls between 3 different time zones.
I'm in that situation right now.
And he was a hardware developer, and Sandy was a programmer. So what they ended up doing when they founded Genesis Electronics, that company developed one of the very first digital telephone voicemail systems.
Oh, nice.
Which they basically said was inspired by having to play all this phone tag with, the time zones.
Mm-hmm.
And they ended up running that as a startup for a few years. Eventually the venture capitalists came in and took the company from them, but they never returned to game development after doing those games for Taito. And last I found out, Randy Pfeiffer was running a small software company that makes modeling software for model train enthusiasts.
Oh.
A company called El Dorado Software. So that's the backstory on Kix. But one more thing I found out. I found out 3 different explanations for where the name comes from.
Okay, good. What are they?
The first one, which is almost certainly not true, is that Nolan Bushnell claimed credit for the name, which right away that isn't true.
Yeah.
Supposedly there was a story going around that because Taito debuted the cabinet at the AMOA show, which was the big coin-op show in October of '81, and supposedly Nolan claimed that he came up with the name because he was playing the demo unit and he got so frustrated that he kept kicking the cabinet. Now that part may be true, but that's not where the name probably came from. Yeah. The second version, which I've heard, is that the Pfeiffers were apparently big Scrabble nerds, and they were joking about what would be a great Scrabble word if it was a real word, and they came up with QIX.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's not a real word, but they were joking. The third explanation, which I think is the actual explanation, is that apparently they had Pfeiffer had a vanity license plate on his car that said "Just for Kicks" QIX, and that's where they got it from. It was just off his vanity license plate.
That makes the most sense out of all 3 of those stories.
Yeah, so that's probably where the name Kix came from. But now I played the NES port because that's what you recommended.
Mm-hmm.
They had nothing to do with any of the ports. They only did the arcade version. And as I said, they sold the rights back to Taito after that. But I like this. I like this one a lot, actually. I've played versions. I have played Kix clones before. I never knew what the original was up until.
What did you think of it? So wait, before you answer that, let me tell the listeners.
Yeah,
so you play as pretty much a little dot, and if you push a button, you could go into the middle of the screen. There's a kind of drawing around the screen like a border, and you just need to fill in the whole screen. You go from one part of a border to another, whether it's a straight line or an L-shaped line or whatever you could design without being hit by a spark or a stick that's spinning through the middle of the screen. The sparks are along the borders of the screen, and you have to fill out a certain percentage of the area. A long time ago, we had a random SNES game called Coma Kingdom, something like that. That was very good. I really liked that one. And so it's same kind of thing, but Kix is the original because they're Kix-likes at this point. And you have a slow... Huh?
I was going to say, one of the early reviews I found for the game described it as a killer Etch-a-Sketch.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy to it. You have a slow or a fast draw button. They actually call it drawing. So yeah, it's a very Etch-a-Sketch type thing. The slow one gets you double the points because you have a more chance of being hit by one of the enemies. And I described it also as kind of like a proto-Tron light bike game. And
although I think Tron was already in development, though, because Tron came out, I think, in '82.
Yeah,
it was parallel. I don't think one inspired the other.
Totally, yeah, it just feels that
parallel
way.
Development.
And I had this back in the day on the Apple II GS and the Game Boy. It was one of my few Game Boy games, and I really describe this as an example of perfect game design. It's simple, it's fun. I really enjoy playing this. The NES port is fantastic. My only complaint on the NES port is seeing the year 1981 on a game that came out in 1991. Kids don't want to see that.
Now I should give a credit to my friend Alex Smith, who runs the long-running video game history podcast, They Create Worlds. He did an episode on Taito, and he talked a little bit about Kix development as well. Now, according to his podcast, he said this was kind of a success for Taito as an arcade game. They probably sold only about 10,000 arcade units, which is still decent for an arcade game of that era. But I went back and looked at some of the industry trade publications, and it seems like when it premiered in November and December, it had a very good November and December in the arcades, but by May it had kind of fallen off the charts. And Alex speculated that one reason this was kind of a flash in the pan for the arcade version was because the game was randomized. That's another thing too, is that it was a randomized game. There were no patterns you could memorize, and that kind of inhibited. Alex thought that inhibited score chasing, which is why it probably fell out of favor in the arcade so quickly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I've only seen this once or twice as an arcade cabinet. It wasn't very well distributed, whether it was their fault or not.
I mean, it was still the best success that Taito America apparently had in this period.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, nothing was going to touch Space Invaders. That was, Taito never had another success on that scale. So it would be 10,000 was considered a modest hit for the time period for an arcade cabinet. But and again, that's just an estimate. We don't have. I don't think we have a hard figure on that.
And there are I'm not quite sure if it's one or two. If these are the same games, but there is Ultimate Kicks on the Sega Genesis, which is a big upgrade. You are actually a spaceship in this one, and you reveal images kind of like that Kokoma game. And it is also called Volified. And so that is kind of my Mandela effect with Kicks is I swear I had a Kicks TurboGrafx card, but it is Volified on PC Engine.
So if I'm not mistaken, and I could be mistaken about this, but I believe that was the Taito Japan release of the game.
But it's way updated. It's definitely a sequel.
Yeah, it came out, I think it was like a year later. So basically the Taito Japan people took the game and just redid it for the Japanese market, and that's what that game is.
But on the Genesis, it's definitely 16-bit graphics. It looks awesome. And it's much harder.
You can still, I actually check because I run Linux on my computer. You can still find versions of Kicks on various Linux distributions. There's one here on Fedora that I tried.
Oh, cool. Wow. I didn't think about that.
That's why, because I knew I have played this game before, and it was almost certainly a Linux clone. But I didn't know the original, and I didn't know it was called Kicks. And I honestly, I would never have guessed this was an arcade game.
And then
because it's so different.
And then last episode, Nate Peters of Doodle World and Doodle World 2, pick them both up, shows Tiny Toons Adventures on the NES.
Yeah, my first time playing this.
What did you think of this one?
It's a platformer. So I should say I grew up a Genesis kid. Outside of Mario, I've never really played any other NES platformers. Yeah, I played it. I liked it overall. I only made it to like the second stage, but yeah, I can see why this was a good game in terms of how it controlled in the physics. Yeah, it seems like a very good platformer.
Oh, it's totally solid. It's December 1991 by Konami. It feels like, to me, it feels more like a Capcom game, which is not a complaint. It's a compliment. I like Konami and Capcom, but for platformers, Capcom has so many great ones, especially like Disney type ones.
So I do have a little background on this one as well. So I don't know if you know, but I don't know if you covered this on the podcast, but earlier this year, the Video Game History Foundation announced the launch of their new online library. And on a lark, I decided to see if they had anything about this, and they do. There's a producer, a former Konami producer named Mark Flipman, donated all of his papers to the VGHF. And in his papers, there's some documents related to the development of Tiny Toons Adventures. And the one that caught my attention was there's a copy of the letter from Warner Brothers Licensing to Konami spelling out the terms of the license. Oh, wow. So you want to guess what the upfront guarantee was?
No, I couldn't even guess.
So Konami had paid Warner Brothers $1 million upfront for the rights, plus another $322,500 as an advance against royalties. So that basically was the royalties for the first 300,000 cartridges sold.
So that's what Konami paid for the rights to Tiny. Wow.
And then there'd be additional royalties. I think of $1.50 on any cartridges past 300,000.
Wow. I wonder if they sold that many.
Yeah, that I couldn't find out. I don't know. I don't think it topped 1 million, because I've seen lists of like NES games over 1 million and it wasn't on there. But I don't have any reliable data on how many they actually sold. And the contract also covered other platforms. Although was it on any other platforms?
No, I don't think so. Not that I know.
Because the licensing deal also covered Game Boy, computers, handhelds, and even coin-op if they decided to make it a coin-op machine.
Oh, wow. No, Wikipedia says only NES.
But, VGHF has a lot. The VGHF archive also has a copy of the original design document, which actually shows the Japanese artist's conception drawings for the game, which is really fascinating.
That's really cool. Yeah.
I'll send you the links so you can put it in the notes.
Yeah, please. And so these are, this game was December 91, like I said, Capcom. You play as Buster Bunny. You need to save Babs Bunny from Monty. And in it, like I said, you play as Buster, but you pick an alt character, or if you find the Star Ball, I think it is, you change into either Plucky, Dizzy, or Furball.
It was a Star Ball.
Yeah. And so Plucky can briefly fly and swim better than the others. Dizzy can destroy walls and most enemies with a spin mode, and Furball can climb many vertical surfaces. So you get you kind of play the game in different ways depending on which alt you choose. And Nintendo Power places at 19th out of their top 20 games in their March 1993 issue, which is still pretty late for top 20 NES games for that point. And I think it plays great. The graphics are good. Like you said, I didn't get too far in it. Yeah, I got somewhere into the second level, but as a kid, if this is one of the few games you had, you definitely find a way to beat it after a while. And really, my only complaint is the music kind of grates on me after a while.
The only handheld console I have here is I have a refurbished 2DS, and I played it through an emulator on the 2DS, and the sound is so bad on a 2DS I couldn't really even hear the music.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Because I didn't have headphones on, I was just using the 2DS speaker.
So which, as a guest, you get to choose a Game Club game. Which, what would you like to choose?
So I am going to choose since I had a Sega Genesis as a kid, I thought I'd pick a Genesis game. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to pick a game, you may not have heard of this one, called Fatal Labyrinth.
No.
So I can explain Fatal Labyrinth quite simply. It's Rogue. It is just straight up Rogue with Sega Genesis graphics. This game was actually originally released in Japan for the MegaNet service, when that short-lived modem service they had in Japan for the Genesis, or I guess the Mega Drive. Mm-hmm. And then it was re-released a year later in North America as a cartridge game called Fatal Labyrinth. I think the original title was Labyrinth of Death.
And is this one you grew up with?
Yeah, played it as a kid, and I just played it again recently because I got a Genesis emulator also on my 2DS. And if you've ever played Rogue, it's Rogue. That's all I'll say about that.
Nice. So that's good. I've been wanting, Rogue or NetHack or something to be a Game Club game soon, and it's always one that isn't the easiest to get into. So this is a good gateway into that.
I would agree, absolutely. If you've never played NetHack or Rogue, this is a very good way. I can't remember off the top. Well, not that I ever came close to completing it. I think it's 30 levels. Now it's randomly generated each time. It follows Rogue rules, so it's randomly generated loot, randomly generated levels, and you attack creatures just by walking into them because it is just straight up Rogue.
Nice
in terms of gameplay.
Well,
I thought that would be a good choice.
Well, I'm going to choose Metal Slug 2 or Metal Slug X. X is just an upgraded version and more difficult version of 2. So it fixes some bugs, but it's also more difficult. So Metal Slug 2 or X or Fatal Labyrinth. If any of our listeners play any of those games, please email us. Email at retrogameclub.net. It's email at retrogameclub.net. We'd like to hear your thoughts. If you play Tiny Toons Adventures kicks or any kicks like... if you cook any Pac-Man dinners, if you download the new OutRun unofficial port, or if you find some bugs in Super Mario 64, again, that is email at retrogameclub.net. And I'd love to hear other listeners try to watch a few Computer Chronicles or Net Cafe episodes. I'd love to hear your thoughts to see if we're just crazy people that loves this stuff. And we also have our link tree. We have a very active Discord, so please check out the show notes. All our links are in there, and they're all maintained by Zach, who I suspect you will see in the next episode. We do have some listener feedback. SM, you feel like taking the first one?
So Majors writes in talking about the game checkout policy at work while working at software, etc. I think most kids that worked at the software stores did it mainly for the access to play new games for free. I know I did. I got most of my Sega CD, PS1, and Saturn games playing via the employee benefit. Abused as much as it did give workers hands-on experience with the current games to help assist customers, in my opinion. So you were talking about tricked out Apple computers.
Mm-hmm.
I never had an Apple at home, only at school, so I never beefed up a 2C or GS. But I've been going down an MSX rabbit hole with a friend, and it seems we are going to upgrade the VDP on his MSX2 to upgrade it to an MSX2 Plus. It seems a little silly for a slight upgrade on such an old 8-bit PC, but that's the hobby we seem to enjoy. And then finally, regarding guest hosts, I observed that Keith on the last episode said he was a Sega guy with his appreciation of the 32X and Sega CD, in contrast to Ken, who turned his back on Sega with the Genesis launch. I like how Rob is keeping a balance of guest hosts. I guess Rob is the resident TurboGrafx 16 fanboy, rising above the console war silliness.
Well, the MSX stuff, it's a strange system, right? Because it's a set platform, kind of like 3DO type situation, but a lot of the games required upgrades to it. So it's really, really strange system. So upgrading that's kind of fun. Yeah.
So, and I would point out, actually, there is a first season Computer Chronicles episode where they talk about the MSX.
Really? Like 1983?
Well, because what they're doing, Stuart did an entire episode focused on the state of the Japanese industry, like where he basically expensed a trip to Japan on the company credit card.
I have seen that one. That's a good one.
And he interviewed Kei Nishi, who was one of the people behind MSX. So they were talking about it in '84. So and they were talking about it as a potential threat to the U.S. computer market.
So I feel like we just gave Majors some homework. Majors, you got to seek out that episode and let us know what you think.
And it's on my blog somewhere where I wrote the recap if you don't want to watch it.
And Hugh writes in, he remembers seeing Kix played in an arcade as a kid, but he thought he had terrible graphics because he was a dumb kid. That's his words, not mine. And
I see that.
He first played it on a cell phone, a Kix clone, and that's when he got into the game and played it a few times, and he's very awful at it. For Tiny Toons Adventures, he thought it was way easier than Kix, and it was clearly an inspiration for Doodle World. And in the top 3 non-Mario platform games for the NES. And yeah, that's probably my take. Probably at least top 5 in there. And then as for movies, because we had a question about video games that could be made into movies or TV shows. He says Qbert as a dystopian future where social media influencers are nothing more than lip filler and fake orange tans. And also they just pretty much speak gibberish. As the collective attention span of society shrinks, they are forced to create more and more extreme content to retain the viewers. This leads to them participating in death game sets and constantly color-changing pyramids where they fight genetically modified serpents. And I think that is an amazing idea. And so Majors and Hugh, thank you for those emails. And I like all these answers. I'm really shocked about how good a lot of these could be getting into our social media feedback for the same question. No Swear Gamer says Pong, the TV show, it should be at least 8 seasons. and
8 seasons in a movie.
Yeah. And maybe a prequel. And
yes.
And Space Quest 2, he says it could, if it's done right, it could be a great show. It could be in the Star Trek formula. And yeah, I think that is a fantastic idea. It could be like Naked Gun style humor. I think that's a great idea. I answer this one as well. And I actually said Leisure Suit Larry. And I'm not really trying to be funny with that. I think you could do this show without being that I'm saying that without being objectifying to women. And it would be kind of like 40-Year-Old Virgin meets Superbad. You know, it's a guy with a 70s vibe who's trying to lose his virginity with someone he actually respects. And, you know, I do want to disclaim with this that I'm not saying this should actually happen. I'm just saying I'm playing the game of what would be fun to see, you know, made into a show.
Compared to some of the other games they've actually made into movies and TV shows, it's a more logical choice than a lot of them.
Yeah. I do think it could work. I think a lot of the Sierra, early Sierra games could work. But Starsky writes in saying Half-Life, and he doesn't necessarily think that it could be a Half-Life show, but like an Office type show set in Black Mesa. And I think that's an amazing idea. I think Valve should really get on that. He also says Command and Conquer, which I don't know that game too well, but I'll take your word for it. Have you played any Command and Conquer?
No, I rarely play any games involving gunplay.
And Retro Gaming Dev says Sea of Thieves, Helldivers, Left 4 Dead, and Among Us. And Retro Stuff says Mega Man, Final Fantasy, specifically 4, 6, stories and characters, and Contra. And Contra could be funny. And let's see, someone else writes in Conquerors, like Bad Fur Day, Elden Ring, and Dino Crisis for sure. And thank you all for that feedback. I seriously want all of those to happen. And our next social media / email us question of the episode is from No Square Gamer. What arcade cabinet would you like the opportunity to play? Whether it's a cab you've never played or would just like to play it again.
I know my answer to that question.
Are you going to tell us or are you going to write in?
I'll tell you right now. I've played it before, but if I could own one arcade cabinet right now, it would be Tapper from Midway.
Oh, nice. Yeah. The original, the Budweiser one or a root beer one?
Yeah, the Budweiser one. I don't think I ever played the Budweiser one. I think I only ever played the other one, and I wanted to play the Budweiser one. Yeah. And I had that game on the Apple IIc, which was not the best port.
Yeah. Well, if anyone would like to give us feedback and participate in the show, please email us. Email at retrogameclub.net or get on our Discord. Links all in the show notes. And SM, thanks so much for visiting with us today.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.